morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my session. I'm super excited to share with you this project that I've worked with. And it's a project that showcases how communities can come together and build things both in React and Vue and Ember maybe, and Angular, and kind of build something that everyone else out there will be able to benefit from. And this is the project that we're going to look into. It's basically a demo that has been built by my colleague, Sarah Dresner. And she worked on this project to showcase how we can build beautiful transitions on the web that are very similar to the transitions that you would see in a mobile application. Like recently, a lot of the web interactions have been criticized for not keeping up with all the changes that we might have, or all the good stuff that we might have on mobile phones. And as you can see here, a couple of the things that we can do with this project is basically navigate from one page to the other. And as we do that, there's certain transitions that happen that are very smooth and that help the user navigate those pages. But also it brings focus and attention to which are the elements that are super important on that page. And that's what we should be using animations and transitions for. We should use them to help our users to understand what's the map of our application and how they should be using our app. Sarah has written an article, an in-depth one, where she explains all of these concepts. I highly recommend you check it out. It's available on CSS Tricks, and the title is Native-like Animations for Page Transitions on the Web. I also built this app in Angular using Angular, and you can find it on GitHub on my profile, and you will see all of these concepts explained, but I'm going to dive into some of them today with you. So the initial project was built using Nuxt, which is a server-side rendering library for Vue, and Vue.js, which we've all heard about, and we're excited to learn about. And my goal was to take that application and port it to Angular using Angular Universal, which is the equivalent of Nuxt. It helps us build server-side rendered applications, and Angular. And there's other people that have done the same for React using React and Next.js. So transitions. We can build beautiful animations using both transitions and animations, or we can build beautiful movement using transitions and animations. And transitions basically describe what happens when an object changes between two states. So with transitions, we only have two states, and by adding a transition, we are defining how the object is changing between those two states and how the browser will apply those changes. And this is an example where basically without a transition on your left-hand side, you can see that the change where I'm changing the width of the element, it happens very abruptly. It doesn't look nice, it doesn't feel very good. Whereas on the right-hand side, we are applying a transition, which by adding an easing function and time when that transition happens, and it looks much nicer to the eye. The movement is much easier to follow. And this is how we would define a transition. We have to tell which is a property that we want to apply the transition to. And in this case, it can be, we can use the all word, which means that we will apply the transition to everything that changes on that element. Or we can break it down to things like, if we only want to apply this transition to maybe the change in the width or a transform, we can do that easily by defining the property there. The duration tells us how long will this transition take. The timing function defines how long the speed over the duration that we're going to apply. And an example here is the easing function, which will tell us that we start slow and then we move very quickly, and then towards the end, we stop as slow as well. And we can also apply delays to transitions, so we can tell here in milliseconds or seconds, like how long do we have to wait until this transition will take effect. And looking back at our project, this is one transition that we'd like to implement. Basically, whenever we move from one page to the other, we want to make sure that as the header page changes, the header image changes, we want to apply a transition so that it's smooth and it looks nice. And in Vue, we would do that using an element called transition group. And this is, for those of you that are familiar with Vue, this is a directive, and this sounds familiar in Angular as well. This object, this directive, we normally use it when we want to animate a list of elements. And it uses under the hood concept called flip, which allows us to develop some really complex, or does some really complex mathematical operations for us, so that animations are really slick. And what this directive does is basically it creates a new element for us. That's why we have to define the div tag there. And we can also listen to certain events that happen to those elements. This is how the final HTML will look like. So we will only have an image, and then we'll have a div that has the BK image class, which comes from the previous element. And Vue allows us to, what Vue does and with this element is it adds, depending on the moment in the transition that we are in, it adds a series of classes that we can listen to, and then we can apply some CSS to that. So we can see here that we have the enter and leave stages, and then we have classes like vInterActive, which allows us to hook into the moment when the enter event will happen. And this is how we define the transition. In this case, in Vue, we use BK leave active, and if you remember, BK was the name of the element in the transition group object or element. And we're applying on enter active and leave active, we're applying a transition to all properties that takes 0.4 seconds, and we are applying an ease there. And the same for enter and leave too, we're applying a transform that scales the image. So remember that like very short movement where the images zoom in and zoom out. And then we are applying opacity 0. So what about Angular? In Angular, we have a whole module for us, the Angular animations module, that basically allows us to declare animations using this domain-specific language that Matthias and the Angular team has created. And we can declare animations in our Angular project, and we can reuse those animations. And they're based on the CSS animations or web animations API that's in the works. So how would we get started? After installing the Angular animations module, we would be able to use animations within our component. Just in our metadata, we would add the animations array, and there we would add a trigger which has a name, and this one, the trigger allows us to define how the animation will be triggered and how it will react. So then the transition allows us to define how we're moving from one state to the other. And you can see here that we have this star, arrow star, and this means that we are applying this transition to everything that moves into everything. And this means that, for example, if we're entering a state, like if the element doesn't exist and then we're entering that element has appeared on the page as has been inserted in the DOM, this transition is going to be applied. And then we're we're defining the animations that's going to be applied. And here we can define the time that the animation is going to take, the function that's going to use, and also if we have any delay, we can add that as well. And then we can also define the style, but that's not necessarily mandatory. It depends what you want to do here. So in our case, we're going to increase the width to 350 pixels. From everything to everything state, that's something that we support by default in Angular, but we can also define custom states. So this would be useful. For example, think of a drop-down menu that we want to create. So we can define the state from when that drop-down is closed. That would be a state. And then another state would be that drop-down is open, and then we would be able to define what happens when we enter and we exit those states. Fantastic. So going back to our view element, how would we take this into Angular? Well, we would remember that the transition group element would create a div element for us. So now we have added the div element that switches based on the page and displays a different image. And then the @header element there is the name of our trigger, and that's how we say that this element is going to be animated using that particular animation. And the definition for this is trigger. We have the header trigger, and on the enter transition, we apply transform, and then we animate that for 4 seconds. That was easy, right? Just a couple of lines of code. And it's not that different. I mean, the fact that we have a whole animations module in Angular is different than the transition group, but the concepts are quite similar. We apply the same idea. Cool. So another thing that we have in this project, and it's interesting to look into, is SVGs. And SVGs are really cool. We can use them to create very small icons that can help us create beautiful shapes only by using mathematics. And some of the advantages are the fact that we have less code to write than, for example, if we had to create those shapes using CSS. They're also easy to animate because SVG elements are part of the DOM, so we can just animate them, and then they're responsive and scalable, and that's because everything's just math. We're looking at vectors. And Tero has written an in-depth article on how to work with SVGs and canvas in Angular. I highly recommend you check it out. It has a lot of detail here. But some of the things that he covers are things like how can we animate SVGs? And we can do that using CSS animations. As I mentioned earlier, SVG elements are DOM elements, so we can just animate them. That means that we can also use Angular animations. But the cool part is that we can also use third-party libraries that use JavaScript to animate elements. And a good example is GreenSock, which is one of the oldest and most popular libraries out there for animations. So one of the SVG elements that we have on this page is that very small icon there. So we can see that we first have a male icon, and then that turns into a plus icon, and the shape changes, and the color of the background changes. And we're going to look into how we animated that very small movement on the y-axis. The way we changed the shape was using GreenSock. So we have this CSS that describes where the element is, and you can see there the transition as well. For 4 seconds, we use an easeOut function, and we apply this transition to all elements. And then the way we're moving that icon is by translating it on the y-axis using transform, translate 3D, and we apply -40 pixel, and then we change the background by using the background property. So that was very simple. It's something that we would change or animate elements like this, no matter whether they're SVG or not. There were a couple of things that I struggled with while working with SVG, which doesn't have to do anything with animations. The first one was the fact that as soon as your code becomes more complicated and you start using nested components, probably you'll have a bigger SVG component that will include other smaller SVG components. And as soon as you do that, you need to start namespacing your elements. So here we have to say that this is an SVG element, so SVG colon line. And if you don't, if like your entire SVG code is within the same component, namespacing is not required, but it's definitely recommended because it's a very declarative way, and we can easily read what our element is. Another issue that I had was as soon as I started adding dynamic properties, like for example, the fill property, which defines the color, I tried to use the property binding that we normally use in Angular, and that didn't work for me. I got this error saying that we cannot bind to fill since it's not a known property on SVGG, and that was weird because that is a known property. I've used fill before and I know it belongs to the group element. And it turns out that when Angular generates the elements, basically there's two different DOM API methods that we can use to generate HTML elements and SVG elements. And we have to, well, actually, that's true as well. But here, the problem was that fill is actually an attribute, is not a property. So we have to make sure that we specify that this is an attribute that we have to set for the group element. And this is because the method that we're setting is not getPath, but is it's getPath of the attribute itself. And then we also have the Attribute Selector. And this is something that whenever we create component, we use component selector. In Angular creates new elements in the DOM. And if we inspect the source, we see that we have an HTML element that in this case, it would be called icon plus. And even though that's not a standard HTML element, the browser knows how to deal with that, and there's no error. It will do the right thing. Whereas with SVG, that doesn't happen. This new element that has been generated, it won't be parsed, and then nothing will be shown on the page, which is what happened to me. Even though I had this whole beautiful SVG defined, as soon as I was including it on a different element, it didn't show up. So it turns out that I had to use the attribute selector. So in this case, using the square brackets to define the element. And this is how we would use it. We would just define, so icon base was another SVG element, and then we would define SVG group. Please include the icon plus element here. So these were some of the adventures in using SVG with Angular. And then here I wanted to show that we could also, with SVG, we can change the shape of the path, or we can change the path of the SVG using animations, and we'd normally do that using JavaScript. So why would we use GreenSock? We want to use GreenSock when we want to create an animation and change the path of that element. Also, SVG allows us to handle or handles the differences between different browsers very easily, so we don't have to deal with that. And it also enables us to create very complex animations. So if you're looking for an animation library, GreenSock is probably the solution for you. The last bit of my journey into porting this project was adding Angular Universal to the Angular project. And this is exactly the order that I worked on this. So I first coded all the project and did all the fancy animations. And then I was like, okay, so now it's time to improve performance, add Angular Universal, and then I'm done. And it's not that easy. Angular Universal is absolutely fantastic. It helps us improve the performance of our applications. And it makes it very fast. But because it generates the static HTML for us, and it minimizes everything and it bundles everything, you can imagine that I ran into debug hell very easily. In order to get started with Angular Universal, we have Angular CLI can help us, and ideally you would get started, create your project with Angular Universal in mind. As soon as you start your project, add Angular Universal, because it makes things much easier, and it helps you identify issues much faster. So I spend maybe 30 or 40% of the time writing the code and building the entire project, and then the rest of the time I spent it debugging issues that were related to incompatibilities between libraries and Angular Universal. So one of them was an incompatibility between GreenSock and the production build, the production mode, like building for production using the Angular CLI. So I had to, here I had to remove the build optimizer. I had to set it to false, because as soon as we were optimizing the build, GSAP didn't work anymore, and it gave us this issue. This has been reported on GitHub, and it's hopefully it will be fixed. Another issue that I had was using the Mapbox library. Again, this is simply related to Mapbox and building for production and Angular Universal. And in order to fix these issues, I'm mentioning this because in order to fix these issues, I basically recreated the project because I was only seeing these errors, and I couldn't read them. I couldn't debug what was happening. So I had to identify which was the culprit for those errors by just slowly rebuilding everything. So it took me quite a bit of time, and this is a small project. You don't want to do that in your production environment. So my conclusion here was that even though Angular Universal allows us to build very, very fast applications for our customers and for our users, sometimes it can turn our development process in a very slow process. So be careful, be mindful there to make sure that you use Angular Universal at the right time in your project, and yeah. So lastly, I wanted to make sure that my Angular project was as performant as all the other versions of the project, which was Vue and the React project. And really, it didn't, like, the code itself was good as it was. What I really wanted to do was achieve 75 points on the Lighthouse score. And for those of you who have played with the Lighthouse tests, they basically give you a score. Ideally, you should have 100. That rarely happens, but whoever gets that, it's really good. And there's a couple of things that they require our project to have in order to be perfect. And the things that I worked on were enabling HTTPS when delivering my project, and most of the things that I worked on were related to how I deployed my project. So it was very important that I used a fast server that supported HTTPS. Also, I used HTTP2 because that makes things faster. Our resources are being delivered in parallel. Our requests are being our requests are being satisfied in parallel. And then another tick box there with the Lighthouse was preloading resources. And with Nuxt, preloading, for example, fonts, we can set that, we can use that out of the box. whereas with the Angular CLI, it has been decided that preloading doesn't add a lot of speed, so you cannot use Angular CLI to preload fonts, for example. We can still preload resources, but it's not just one line of code, one configuration item. And the last bit was caching, having the right caching strategy. And for this, I used nginx again, and I also gzipped my resources, and this has given me like a huge boost in my performance and in the Lighthouse score. So everything here was really related to how we deployed our application. So it's not only the code that we write, it's also the environment in which we deliver that to our users. If you're interested in seeing how this project was ported in React, check out this repository. Xavier created a version written with React and Next. It should be very useful for those of you who are React developers. So, in conclusion, animations, transitions. Animations are simpler than transitions are simpler than animations, but both of them allow us to create beautiful movement in our project. Use whichever works best for your use case. Angular animations, they're absolutely fantastic. They're built on top of the web standard, the web animation standard, and they're also reusable and dynamic. They integrate very well with the rest of our Angular code. Angular Universal, it helps us speed up our application, but do make sure that you include it from the start and you build your application using Angular Universal. SVGs are great for icons, for example. They're super easy to animate. If you get the chance to use SVGs, please do. They're also very, very small. And when it comes to performance, Angular is very performant out of the box. What made the difference for me was the way I deployed my application. And I believe Tara has talked this morning about how you can deploy your application successfully. I want to leave you with this thought. It's a quote from one of Sarah's article where she says that the web has so much potential for beautiful movement, placement, and interaction that reduces the cognitive load for our users. So make sure to keep this in mind when you're building applications and when you're making use of animations and transitions. I want to thank Sarah and Matthias from the Angular team for helping me get up to speed with animations and work through this project. And also Peter was one of the, he helped with a couple of commits to this project. So hope this was useful. Thank you very much.